All right, red light's on. You hit play. You know what that means. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If you're new, welcome. If you're returning, what's up? What's everybody doing? What are you doing like right now? Are you taking a walk? Are you at the gym? Are you at your breakfast? Are you having a cup of coffee? Whatever it is, I appreciate you bringing me into your world in this moment that you're choosing to listen to the show. Thanks. And you know me, those of you who've been around, I don't like to bullshit you, and those of you who've been listening know my life is in quite a bit of personal crisis right now. My daughter is struggling, and it's been really scary, y'all. It's been really scary, I'm not going to lie. I think there's a lot of things that are happening that feel really scary right now, not just inside my house, but outside my house too. And it's easy for me to get completely overwhelmed by it. In fact, it has been quite all-consuming. I've been basically just coming up for air to teach classes and record this show. It's such a mixed bag. On some level, I'm like, maybe I should take some time off. Maybe I shouldn't be continuing to work when I'm being so depleted in other ways. But at the same time, it's also like a saving grace. It's like where I get to resonate in the way that I wish for my soul to resonate. And it's like kind of keeping me sane and hopeful in a time when it's never been more challenging to be that way. So here I am, we're carrying on. And I really do believe those of you have listened, I've talked about this for years and years. I don't believe that life is as fixed as we are led to believe. And the way things happen and the way they unfold, they do so in a way that is beyond my ability to fully comprehend. And I have observed that there is an intelligence to it. It's not just random. And yeah, and there are people out there who are doing work that can be helpful to us in perceiving more clearly and becoming more aware. And that is certainly true of my guest today, Frey Faust, who is creator of the Axis Syllabus, which has been mentioned on a number of occasions on this show. We never really gone into so much what it is and why it is, which we do today. For me, it is another wonderful occasion in which many threads that I've been talking about on the show for a lot of years all sort of come together in one conversation. And I feel like those of you who've been listening for a while, you'll maybe recognize that happens in my conversation today with Frey. I think a lot of the questions that he's asking and what he's putting out there for others to consider absolutely applies to many of the yoga teachers I've been interacting with, and not even just yoga teachers and movers, but society in general. So I was very grateful to have this opportunity to connect with him, and I'm very glad to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to that, I want to say thanks to our podcast premium subscribers. Specifically today, I want to say what's up to Nicole Fox and Alana Cameron. What's up, Nicole and Alana? Thank you. If you have listened to the last year of episodes on this feed and you want to get to the archive, or you want to help support me in continuing to do this, becoming a podcast premium subscriber is how you would do that. If you don't have any money and you want to get to the old episodes, all you have to do is send us an email. We will definitely give you a free account. But if you have a little something to give, it makes a difference. And I'm very grateful to all of you out there who choose to do that. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or the other ways that you could connect with me outside of just listening to this show, whether it's the ongoing live stream classes and the weekly discussions that I conduct. If you like what happens on the show and you would be interested in having more discussion about the things that we talk about here, there are opportunities to do that. And you can find out about all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think we'll just leave it there, and I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get to it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Frey Faust. Hello?
Hello.
Hello. Good to meet you.
Same. Where are you?
Where am I? I am in Pennsylvania, in Easton, Pennsylvania. About 2 hours or hour 45 outside of Manhattan, just on the other side from New Jersey. And you're in Germany, right?
Well, so I'm in Luxembourg at the moment.
Luxembourg. Okay. Well, I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak with you, and I'm really grateful to you. Thank you for giving me your attention and time. It's such a valued commodity these days, so I appreciate that you would give me some today. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. It's always an honor to be able to explain what I'm attempting.
Well, I'm glad to do that with you. And a wonderful thing happened. It happens sometimes with the show where I send somebody an invitation based on just like a vague idea and a gut feeling that, I think there's a good conversation to have here. And then when I'm preparing to speak with them, it becomes very clear, like, wait a second, this isn't just like a gut feeling and an abstract idea. This person is very perfectly positioned to help weave together some threads from the show that have long been weaved here, So maybe just to give you like a little bit of context and anybody who would listen to this, I landed in New York City in 1990, which I believe is the year you left, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yeah.
And I went to school at NYU initially to study acting, but very quickly within like a year became utterly disenchanted with words and transferred to the experimental theater wing, where I studied postmodern dance movement stuff with some people you might know. I studied Alexander technique and some Alan Wayne work with Paul Langland. I studied Six Viewpoints and Hamilton floor bar with Mary Overly. I did like a little bit of developmental movement with Wendell Beavers and rolled around on the floor and tried to get myself into trance states with Nina Martin. And I caught like just like the tail end or like of what you were part of in the 80s. And what I got from that, like what really was my big takeaway from that exploration was the idea of dance, not as like this aesthetic art form or something, but as like a deep inquiry into the nature of myself and in relationship to my environment and others. And that's what I became interested in. However, at that time, in 1994, when I graduated, like the dance world didn't feel like a good container for me. Like going to contact jams and like, I don't know what it was like in the 80s, but it didn't feel like much of a community. It didn't feel very cohesive or coherent. And that's why I landed on yoga, because yoga was all about inquiry into the nature of yourself. And I rode that wave. I taught for 10 years. I had a center for 10 years. And then that wave crashed long before the pandemic, I would say. And I believe it was in 2016 that I had Diane Bruni on this show. And she had that Facebook group, and all these yoga teachers like me were like totally questioning all the shit we had learned. Our bodies were in pain. And she was the first person to mention the Axis Syllabus on this show in 2016. And I think, when I think about what's happening nowadays, like a lot of yoga teachers, I hold these teacher meetings every week. And so many yoga teachers have looked to different somatic movement modalities for new language and new resource because the yoga systems that we learned didn't pan out over the long haul. So all of that is to say, like what you said when we started, like what you're working on or what you're exploring, I can't remember the exact word you used, seems particularly relevant for a lot of yoga teachers right now. And so all of that as some introduction for us, perhaps. I guess my first question to you is, when I talked with Paul on this show not too long ago, like some months back, actually, he described to me how, in the early 80s or when they first started out, it was pretty much like people getting together and like playing music and getting high and rolling around or whatever. But by the time I met him at NYU in the 90s, people like had dance careers or like, so I'm curious, you left right when I got there, and I'm wondering why did you choose to leave the scene? Because that seemed like the center for it. So why'd you leave?
I mean, my beginnings were also informal. My entry into dance was through just an intuitive state of movement, surrounded by people who were listening to live music, and nobody was really paying attention to how high your leg was, or how many times you could turn, or any of the interesting ways you could get to the floor. So for me, the first experience of dancing was a connection to the universe. It was more feeling like a throughway, feeling like a channel for this unnameable energy to come through, feeling like a portal more rather than a performer. It wasn't, at that point, it really wasn't about attention seeking. It was about, connecting up, being a node. And I wanted to do that with other people. That was my interest in continuing to dance. I mean, I was excited by the alternative scene in New York, where people were working in restaurants and doing all these other jobs in order to be able to pay for rehearsal and just get together and do performances wherever. And people just were extremely creative and daring. And the process was very collaborative also. It was more, like a sense of a laboratory. But I made the mistake of trying to enter a company. And as soon as I became a touring dancer, really my love of the art form began to die. Because, it was just the pure repetition, the mechanical repetition of one piece, for example, for a year, doing it hundreds of times, seeing the inside of a theater and a taxi cab and the hotel, independent of all the places that we might visit on the planet, coming back to New York and feeling completely estranged from the dance scene, where I was supposedly a figure, but it was just, I felt alienated. I felt it was all becoming irrelevant, and I was just exhausted. And I also felt underused. Like, I felt the choreographer was extremely respectful, and it was a very good work situation, I think, comparatively speaking. But his line of research was monochromatic. It was just one tangent, and I was very interested in all the different ways I could or might express myself, and also to try to go further with them, to try to even to attempt to fail during performance, and to have that license. And And these performances, the choreographer was being bought and his work was being sold on the basis of success. So he wasn't experimenting. And that just became very oppressive. So when a cultural center in Germany offered me a job as artist in residence, I couldn't say no. And at that time, the dance world was really imploding. The tax laws had changed, and there was no longer a tax haven for large companies to contribute to culture. So these kind of management centers that were communally funded disappeared. Where you could make mailing lists and talk to people about strategy and get in touch with the different theaters or the people who were interested in sponsoring. These small little theaters that were providing startup or first try performance venues, they disappeared. And with them, these informal juries that were, sort of selected on a rotating basis from our peers, where people from different sectors of the dance world would come together and they would watch a piece and they would give you feedback. And that just created a very lively exchange. That was the most wonderful thing about the New York dance scene was its polyform expression. There was just so much allowed, and there was such a large and avid public that it didn't matter what you did or where you did it. You could be certain you would have a group of people watching you. And you would probably also get a review. The Village Voice, had 4 or 5 pages at the time of dance reviews.
Yeah, St. Mark's Church was a thing. Even when I was there, I remember that was like a big venue or whatever. Yeah. It's interesting what you said earlier, because I had a little bit of that experience where when I was trying to make dances, because I did that for a little while, you would do improvs, like you would be in rehearsal space, trying to find like what I think Paul described was as improvisatory virtuosic moments where you were released into what you were doing and you could have never planned that. And it was this perfect moment or whatever. And then you would try to take that and make it into a choreography to perform for other people. And you'd be trying to like take that magic that you had in the rehearsal space and bring it onto this stage. And it never seemed to really translate out. And we tried to come up with ways of structuring the improv so we could have the improvisatory moments while we were in performance. But you could never get past what you said earlier was this layer of needing some kind of approval from the audience that you don't have when you're just moving around by yourself or with friends in a room, And so I could see how you would want that pure exploratory space again and jump at that opportunity to take that gig. I would have took the gig too.
Yes. But it was another trap. I guess I was still imagining that the career, of being recognized and having funding, that would create a space for me to be unfettered, by the concerns of trying to climb the ladder. But I think it's a carrot and stick sort of thing. And I was listening to people, like Wim van de Kebus or, top choreographers who are really well known, and they would tell me, well, it sounded like the same thing. They just felt like they were on a hamster wheel, running after something that they thought they were going to achieve, which was a sort of oasis for creation. But actually it just becomes
jumping through hoops, forever jumping through hoops.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that happened a lot I think it was a cautionary tale that didn't get heeded by the yoga world, in terms of people opening storefronts on 2nd Avenue and setting up shop and having yoga centers and then Yoga Works coming in with venture capitalist funding and opening up chains of spa environment yoga centers. And then the storefront independent can't compete anymore. So in a way, like, it became about real estate. Like, I managed to keep pace. I got into Williamsburg right in the right moment when the rents were still low and it was just bodegas and artists still. And I was able to keep pace for about 7 years before it tilted. And then it was just, you couldn't do it anymore. And I think the same thing happened. Like, New York was a place where I had an apartment in Clinton and Stanton for $600 a month for 10 years. So when you could have an apartment in Manhattan for $600 a month for 10 years, you could be an artist there. You could explore. But once it became mainstream, which I hear you describing in the dance world, it became about whatever, getting the funding and filling out the grant forms, or all the fucking admin that went into having a yoga center. And it's like no longer about the yoga or why you opened the thing in the first place. So it's interesting. So it makes a lot of sense. But even that gig you took in Germany, you said initially still had its trappings.
Yes, because, I was being paid and I was under contract to produce and ostensibly to sell the work to a larger circuit. And in Europe, the funding structures are dominated by a few ministers. They're bureaucrats, and basically they decide what and who is going to be funded. The themes for research, the artistic themes are handed out by them. So whether it's this country that should be favored, or this political view that should be favored, or whether I feel like the artists in Europe are being constrained to be propagandists for the government, basically. And funding is given out on that basis. So, I didn't realize that when I first went in. I thought, wow, I can stay in my pajamas. I can just walk downstairs and dance as much as I like to all day, and once in a while I'll make a piece here. But no, actually, there was a lot of pressure to conform. And for me, that's not the issue of whether it's right or left. It's just the fact of having to conform.
It's the constraints on the process.
Yes, because I think true freedom, or true liberation for an artist is when they discuss or when they share what's fascinating for them, and not what's politically important.
And having like the freedom to like have the space to tap into the void or whatever. Like if it has to start from a predetermined starting point or whatever, I guess there's some constraints that you could still work within, but if the constraints are too much, like I said, it actually impedes the process that is the thing that you're looking to do. It destroys the thing. It destroys your exploration or whatever.
Yes, and having the material means is such a seductive trap. You think, they're going to give me money and space and time, and I'll be able to do finally what I wanted to do. But it doesn't work out that way.
Not usually, huh? When they give you the money, then they get to tell you some stuff. Exactly. They get to have some say, right?
Yes.
Well, yeah. I guess that does sort of bring me to where I guess Axis Syllabus starts, right? Is that seems like, I think and like the timeline I saw was like 97 or something when you first started.
Yes, 97.
So is that where you start to say, okay, I need to try to work outside of this in some way, or when does that happen? When do you start to see, is there an avenue for me to continue without being so constrained?
I wasn't considering that, actually. My own injuries just became a motivating force. But I was born with a dislocated neck, and they crushed my skull with forceps, trying to pull me out. So I had an asphyxiated part of my brain, right above the hippocampus. And this started me off on a challenging road towards health. And many of the things that I was being counseled to do just didn't work for me. So I was collecting bits and pieces of information about how to work with my body, regardless of what authorities or experts were telling me to do. And that process began to gather momentum in New York because choreographers and dance teachers were fairly ignorant, I would say, of anatomy. And also at the beginning of the 80s, they were still very much in the dictatorial mode. So you had to do what they said, or you had to leave. You know, and until like this, the big scandal with the Graham School, when that happened, and there was a confrontation with the teachers about whether or not they had the right to ride herd, you know, or how we're going to redefine teaching as less instructive and more facilitating. I had a bad reputation actually, because I would walk out of classes or walk off the set of general rehearsals or out of rehearsal when I felt that I was being mistreated, or when I felt that the choreographer or teacher wasn't giving me a choice about how to defend my health. And so this compelled me to my first interest was physics, because I was looking at how shear especially is so dangerous, and how to translate shear into compression forces, how to work safely with centrifuge. And that led me towards anatomy. Until the internet started up, you know, in earnest in 97, I didn't have access to all this information. But when it did start, I was able to start looking up studies in earnest, you know, like much more than I was before, because it wasn't as hidden or obscured behind the fortresses of universities and, you know, in scientific conference and so on. And also I could look up anatomy, like I could look up anything that I wanted to. And this really spurred me towards well, it galvanized my questioning of official notions, and especially mainstream authoritative presumptions about training and preparation. And I would have to, you know, include yoga or yoga's, what has been adopted as yoga, because I've since found out that there's a kind of muddled history. It's not so clear how it began, and that it seems like a lot of the exercises or positions are not so old, and they don't actually have a clear purpose other than themselves. So
let me just interject for a second. The episode that's going to happen right before this one, if I'm not mistaken, is with Daniel Simpson, and we discussed that. We discussed how like the earliest yoga was much more about trance, and then at some point after colonialization, all this other stuff got brought in. So what you're saying, the listeners will have just heard a lot about. So
yes,
your point is well taken.
Yeah. So what happened? I began to view formalism with skepticism. Not necessarily that form was at fault, but it was more that it seemed people would get addicted to the form over the principles that motivated it, and that even the body itself, you know, the kind of normalization tendency with the external grid applied to a flattened body that was more designed or idealized rather than real. and how much that actually contributed to errors in an individual's appraisal of their limitations or potential, and that those errors would eventually show up then as a chronic injury or traumatic injuries. Because it's like, it's not a question of whether or not this or that movement or position is harmful per se. It's more that the standardization is a rejection of the unique variation of each person on the cosmic blueprint of the spiral.
Just wait. We all just have to take in what you just said for a second. I mean, I have to take in what you just said for a second. I mean, I think there's a lot of yoga teachers who are going to be listening to this who have got like bells going off in their head right now. It just, in terms of, in a yoga context, I speak for myself, the kind of imposition of like the idea of lines and geometry on our systems and trying to execute that with some quote unquote idea of precision and the effects that had. And when you say, what I heard you say is that Axis Syllabus wasn't like some reaction to the funding. It was like you trying to figure out your pain, like you trying to heal yourself, which is exactly what's happening with yoga teachers. Like, I can't bear the idea of trying to make myself into lines. As I've heard you say, it's all curves and spirals, and that formalization. I guess there is some potential role for form, but I guess how the form is derived from, or I guess, again, it seems to me that going back to Axis Syllabus, coming out of this in you, that seems where you started to try to like write shit down. Is that the deal? Like, let me try to write down all the stuff I'm compiling or ideas I've got in my head or things I'm exploring in movement. Is that where it begins?
Yes. And that's why I don't call myself an author. I'm a consolidator, because I went out and found all the literature and I put it together and I try to make sense out of it. I try to describe at least how I perceive it. And then I've submitted the document to the review of my students and fellow teachers and other colleagues outside of the Axis Syllabus group with the idea to have it be under permanent review and editing, so that it doesn't stay a subjective point of view per se, but more like a meta-subjective process that could go towards science, that could go towards the idea, at least, of the scientific axiom, that the more you know, you don't know, or the more you realize you don't know. Mm. So I think form is important. Rituals are important. However, I also think that reality is blurry.
It's not fixed. You can't keep the forms fixed, right? They gotta be able to change, right?
Like nests have to be built and inhabited, but the fact is that they fall apart and are ultimately no longer useful after a while and should be abandoned for other nests or for a larger context when it's appropriate. Just think like if the bird family got addicted to the situation of the nest and just tried to stay there at all costs, that would be a deadly situation for them. It would be untenable. But I think that is what happens in a lot of social circumstances, and yoga's, I think, is, what's happening to yoga or what happened to it is a good example, but it's a tendency, I think, in many different social circumstances. We can see there's a good initiative, somebody has deep insights and they communicate that, and then what happens around it becomes very oppressive, rather than the questioning process being furthered regularly. Yeah,
it's a story that's been told a bunch of times where people met Mr. Iyengar in the 70s or whatever, and it was like 15 people, and then flash forward 10 years later, he's like in a room full of 600 people, and it's become standardized. And as you say, the form becomes institutionalized in a way and loses its initial spark from which it came.
Yes, and like the fundamental is you can't know what another person actually needs because you're not living in their body. So, even though there's a lot of similarities, the material is arranged in a subtly different way that works out in actual almost opposite needs or rhythms or predilections. And so you can, I think, as a teacher or as a project leader, you can counsel. But if you start to impose, that's a tremendous liability. I also think that it's society encourages people to be slavish, in that they would rather have someone else tell them what to do. Of course, it's convenient when something goes wrong. You can blame someone else. It's very hard to take responsibility for comparing different approaches or counsel and then making up your own mind. What happens if you fail? And I think failure is an inherent part of any learning process. I mean, there's waste and there's failure, and that's really hard to accept. So people tend to want to work with something that's established, because at least there's the patina of success. Like, even if it's an illusion,
you can outsource the navigation to your GPS and not have to remember how to get there.
Exactly. Yes. The GPS is emblematic.
Yeah, that's exactly what came to mind when I heard you saying that, because I catch myself, like, I'd make myself turn it off. It's like, I know how to get there. I don't need this fucking GPS. So I hear what you're saying. Wow. Well,
something that sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
Something that recently came to my attention was the historical argument over standard anatomical position. The standard anatomical position is with the feet turned parallel, the hips, the pelvis tucked, and the hips extended, the arms, the shoulders externally rotated, and the palms offered forward, the chin tucked, so that the spine is almost flattened. Mm-hmm. And this position it was decided on in the 1400s. So really, actually relatively recently, and it was argued as a healthy posture for humans. And it was also given as the starting point for measuring the other rotations: flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. So zero. And it is a flattened posture. And if it's basically taken from a corpse lying down on the dissection table. And a lot of anatomy actually was studied from corpses. So basically wrecks, lifeless husks, instead of functioning bodies. And this, I think, is one of the things that has been it's been a powerful influence, because it's taken as sort of the postural measure for health. But it's actually a dead person, like our model for a healthy living person.
I mean, it's crazy to hear you say that, because that idea was certainly adopted by these yoga gurus who, like, we all worshipped at the altar of axial extension. And I was guilty of it. And to this day, I believe pain because it's a pattern. I had to undo forever holding my spine as straight as I could, because I spent so much time thinking that was like an ideal. It's a deeply ingrained pattern, and I had to work continually to this day to break it. So it's certainly, to hear it say that's based on, it doesn't work for a live person. That was my experience. Like that, trying to hold my body to that kind of idea of this is the healthiest posture, or even one right alignment, which fucked us all up. It's because you say there's an individual cosmic blueprint for each person, like we started, and to try to impose upon it
with some kind of dogmatic idea of what's ideal is never going to work well for somebody, I don't think.
You have a planet which is creating a 3D well in space. So that means that there's a web, a net. The fabric of space-time is curving around, and energy is like if you could imagine a 3D drops in water, raindrops that are creating these wells that are spreading out in all directions, and they're interdigitating. They're moving past each and through each other, and either they're arguing or they're confluent, and together they manifest as a form. They manifest as what we are. We're swimming in this nexus. We're born of it, and it's not. I wouldn't say that there's a blueprint for each of us. I would say that is the blueprint for all of us. It's just that the waves come together and manifest is going to be fractal and not factory replications, but reiterations of an idea. So you can still see vestigial fingers and hand bones in whales, buried in their flank. Or basically there's so many other animals that share all of the organs that we have and all of the bones in some other shape or other. And you can see other animals dreaming, and understand that they have emotion. You can see even a worm shying away from a lit match, because it has a sense of self-preservation. You can see that plants argue with each other over space, even argue with themselves.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.